Thank you, Chairman. Let me, at the outset, first associate myself with Senator King's remarks, particularly regarding the fact that this budget only focuses in one of the available areas in which we could make deficit progress. And also, as a caveat, we've only seen this budget for a few hours, so I may, these are preliminary comments, but what I do see is that for all the smashing and slashing that is done through the programs that regular families depend on for their kids in public school, for their grandparents in nursing homes, for the basic needs that lower-income people make, the dominating principle of this budget, the one that achieves primacy over every other principle, is that every tax loophole is sacred. There is not a nickel spent to reduce the deficit, which is described as a dangerous financial crisis by the chairman. Well, you have to measure how serious the rhetoric is by what you're willing to sacrifice to solve the problem. And this budget is a clear confession that the so-called dangerous financial crisis is actually less important than protecting, say, the carried interest exception, which helps hedge fund managers, as our ranking member pointed out, pay tax rates as low as brick masons and truck drivers. So in that sense, it's typical. I've brought this point up, I think, every single hearing that we've had, and every single time, here we are again. Every single tax loophole is sacred. And we've had hearings on revenues in which Republican witnesses have said we need to have revenues be a part of this, and still every tax loophole remains sacred. Following on Senator Kane's questions, I'm interested in finding out how a budget that purports to root out Obamacare, root and branch, and repeal it in its entirety, and counts $2 trillion in savings from repealing its coverage provisions, leaves in $1 trillion in Obamacare revenues. That's the way I read it. That seems to be an unusual combination. And it certainly doesn't account for the reduction in federal health care spending of $2.4 trillion since the passage of the bill, which I think has some, perhaps not an absolute, but some connection to the Affordable Care Act. I'm very nervous that this budget introduces so-called dynamic scoring, and it does so in a complete free-fire zone in which it is entirely selective when and where so-called dynamic scoring is used. And as far as I know, there are no ground rules to govern it. And if we start down this path, then dynamic scoring can be used. That's a sword that cuts both ways. There are no rules for it, and I think it's a very dangerous principle to unleash without any principles that govern it. Finally, I will say that I will challenge all of my colleagues on the other side to take the $250 million in cuts below sequester in non-defense discretionary spending and actually put them into appropriations accounts. We are living here in a budget fantasy land, which perhaps explains why more than half of the seats in this room are empty while we have this debate. I don't think you can do it. I don't think there's one person on the other side of this aisle who could take cuts of the savagery and magnitude that this budget contemplates and actually put them down into the accounts and then defend what actually happens when you move away from budget abstract and actually go to the programs that people count on. For every taxpayer who's angry about paying their taxes, there's a grandmother who's in a nursing home someplace counting on Medicaid. There's another grandparent or a parent who's somewhere counting on Medicare. There's a nephew who counts on the school lunch program in the school down the street. You can't just look at one angry taxpayer and assume that that is what America is all about, and particularly not for people who really can't make choices any longer because they're too old, too ill, or still children. As far as I can tell, this budget doesn't meet any good, reasonable budget-keeping seal of approval in terms of the tricks and gimmicks that are in it. It is fundamentally unfair. It is completely inconsistent with the rhetoric about how dangerous the debt crisis is, because it puts every single tax loophole in the country's code in a higher place of importance than that supposed crisis, I would say that the wealthier you are and the more you care about yourself over your neighbor and your country, the more you will like this budget. I yield back my time.